What are we to make of this text? I don't know if you're familiar with that scripture lesson. There's a few stories in the Bible that frankly, I wish they really were not in it. And this is one of them. I don't like this text, or at least I was never really fond of it. Over the years, I've been more open to it, but I don't like the image. I don't like the portrayal of Abraham. I don't like how God is seen in this. This is uncomfortable for me. And if I had to imagine, probably the same for you. This is not the joyful, grace-ridden, or at least on first glance, it doesn't seem like that. But if you know anything about the Abraham passages inside the book of Genesis, this is the climax. This might be the most important passage inside of Abraham's life. And even though it's a difficult passage, there are others inside the Bible that if you stay with them long enough, these passages that seem confusing or seem, they're not easy. They actually can bring the most satisfaction. When we find Abraham in this passage, he's older. By now he's an old man, and for years, you need to go back and look at some of the previous passages. For years, he's wanted nothing more than a son, and he's been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and he finally receives one in Isaac. And can you imagine how much he loved him? To be waiting on this, and then finally Isaac comes and holding him as an infant, and then as he grows into a toddler, and probably now in this passage, maybe preteen type age, the level of love and devotion that he had towards Isaac, you can just see that in the text. He's been waiting for this for decades, and all of a sudden Isaac is here, and the joy of just watching him develop, and then just out of the blue, to hear a passage that says, let him go. That's difficult. It is as parenting. And we have no doubt he's talking about Isaac, because Isaac shows up, it says it 3 times in the passage. Take your son, your only son, Isaac. 3 times Isaac is named. It says you need to take him and then sacrifice. That's, to say challenging, that's maybe trying to spin it in a nice way. What are we to do with this? Maybe the closest analogy that we could at least relate to this text is when a family has to make that very difficult decision, when a loved one, when they've actually moved into the death process to remove medical devices. But even then, that analogy is limited, because in our case, it would be when the person has already moved into the death process. Here, this young man, there's no signs of death at all, at least not in Isaac. I marvel at Abraham. One of the things that are just fascinating to me is every time, whether it be in this passage or other passages, where he hears from God to do something, the next paragraph is Abraham just getting up and doing it. In Genesis 12, he's told to follow. He just gets up and follows. In this passage, he's told to do something, and he rises early. I bet he can't sleep or couldn't sleep. We know something about Abraham. We know that he's very wealthy, and wealthy people do not saddle their own donkeys, nor do they cut their own wood. And so you can see that he's wrestling with this. Can't sleep. Don't know what to do. You can see and feel the anxiety, the pain, maybe even the frustration. For 3 days they journey. Can you imagine what that's like? 3 days. You wake up, you go to sleep, you wake up, you go to sleep, and you know at the end of the journey what's at stake. Finally, he reaches the mountain, and he looks over at the 2 servants and says, stay here, the boy and I will go worship. What's worship? At least here in this text. sacrifice. Now, maybe not to the same level, but at least in the New Testament, when Paul talks about worship, he says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. And so maybe not in this manner that we see in Genesis 22, but at least in some form, when we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, when it comes to worship, sacrifice is involved. And so one of the questions I ask of myself is that, Shane, if you're worshiping and it's not a sacrifice, is it worship? That's an interesting question. Notice that Abraham takes the dangerous items. He takes the knife. He takes the fire. You can see a dad watching over his son. Well, Isaac is old enough and has been around his mom and dad enough to know that worship in some form is a part of their life, that that faith is important to them. He's watched them worship before, and so he's not dumb. He looks out and says, well, I'm carrying the wood, you have the knife, you have the fire, where's the lamb? And the answer is, God will provide. That's sort of a ambiguous answer, isn't it? We do that at times when we really don't want to explain to our children what's going on, right? Somebody has a surgery, well, they've got a boo-boo. We got to go to the doctor and fix it. Someone dies, well, they're going to heaven. Divorce takes place, well, mom and dad, they're just going to live in different homes. We give those type of answers, don't we? Dad, where's the lamb? Oh, God will provide. Just keep walking. We have a great deal in common with Abraham, more than we know. So Abraham finally gets to the resting place and he builds the altar and he ties Isaac to the altar and he raises the knife. The text doesn't describe it, but if you put yourself in the text, can you imagine how slow the seconds would be? I bet he looks down into his son's eyes, sees the confusion, the fear, maybe looking up into his dad's eyes, seeing the same thing. Well, about that time, and I appreciate the inflection, because Hebrew does not have exclamation points or bold or underlining or italics, and so for them to give emphasis to something, they have to restate it. And so this is not a voice that says, Abraham, Abraham. It's more like a shout. Abraham! Says it twice. And Abraham looks up and he sees this ram in the thicket. And they sacrifice it. And they give it the title, The Lord Provides. I think I would come up with something a little bit more dramatic than that. That sounds kind of too churchy, doesn't it? I think this would have been Shane dances in the streets and shouts a couple of hallelujahs. The Lord provides just seems like it's not enough. What do we make of this? Some commentaries, if you ask them, what they say is this is the final conversion of Abraham. See, Abraham comes out of this culture, this pagan culture, and dealing with our past can be so difficult, to where it no longer influences us. And Abraham comes out of this pagan culture where deity at best are angry with humanity. They're indifferent with humanity. And so what your role is when it comes to worship is for you to sacrifice. And in that culture, the supreme sacrifice is to give a son, give a child. And so what commentaries, some will say, is that this is Abraham finally dealing with all of his upbringing about what it means to worship. Our past, it takes a while for that to die. Still controls us at times. How many of us today allow what we've done in the past to dictate our actions, our future actions? Mistakes we've made, regrets, the actions, the words that we've spoken that have broken relationships, the addictive patterns that we continue to feed over and over and over. See, again, it's not, we think this is somebody else. Maybe it's us the text is about. But there's some that says, if you ask what's going on, what's really at stake here, this is the final process of conversion for Abraham. I don't think that's the case. And let me tell you why. If you go back to the beginning of the text, it talks about test. We have experiences in life that maybe what we would do is classify them in the form of test. Now, test is not the same as temptation. Temptation is something to do that is wrong, that leads to, and you're not worried about the outcome, you're not worried about the repercussions. Test is a little bit different. Tests are those experiences that are incredibly difficult, but can lead to something greater. Here's what I think the test is for Abraham, and it's also the test for us. Do you understand that there are things and people that have been given to you that are gifts? And if we're not careful, they can be idols. Sometimes that's people. See, when something, even something good, that becomes consuming, the object of your worship, then it dictates everything that you do. That can even be a person. For a parent, might even be a child. What happens if your whole identity is tied to another person? If you're a parent to a child, I mean, how do you even say no? How do you even form a boundary? How do you make those hard decisions that you know are painful and not easy, but without them, it leads to destruction? You ever seen a child that's never been told no? They have no concept of authority, no concept of reality. Maybe it's a person. A gift that's been given. Maybe it's not a person. Maybe it's a thing. We do that at times as well. Where something that either we have or possess or own, and it becomes like an idol. So much so that it dictates our thoughts, it dictates our actions, it'll dictate behavior. And we see that sometimes inside of our own life. See, and when you lose that then, when that's taken away, there's levels of anger, there's level of brokenness, because all identity is lost. Gifts, you know what life is like? This is life. There are periods of times where you have received. And so much of your life is about receiving. And my life is about receiving. And then there's a season of your life where it's about holding. And so you're holding on to things. And then there's part of your life that's about relinquishing, letting go. It happens with people, and it happens with things. I guess probably about 10, well, it's more than that, maybe 15 years ago, did a couple of mission trips to Costa Rica. And I noticed something when I was down there, that when they talked about people and they talked about things, they always did it with their palms up and open. But then when they talked about other things, they'd be closed. And so I didn't know if that was a cultural thing or what. And so I called the translator over and I asked the pastor through the translator, what, is this something that just shows up in Costa Rica? He said, well, we just know that with people and things, the best thing for us to do is hold on to them loosely. They're gifts, which means there's a time where you receive, and then there's a time where you hold on. And there's also a time when you relinquish and let go. Maybe that's the test for Abraham. Maybe that's the test for us. Can you see the cross in this? It's amazing to me. 3 times in the text, take your only son. He's carrying the wood on a mountain for a sacrifice. This is what's fascinating to me. God never asks of us something he's not willing to do himself. There is that a part of life. Receiving, holding, and relinquishing. And if we're not careful, when it comes to the things that are gifts that bless your life, they even can become idols. That can be destructive. Because it'll prevent us from being the person we need to be and doing the things we need to do that bring about wholeness. I don't think it has anything to do with the final conversion from his culture. I think it's a test for all of us with what we've been given in the form of people and in the form of things. You've received, you hold, and then you let go. Oh God, we give thanks. And maybe the best analogy of that is communion. To hold gifts given that come straight from you. And so God, as we hold these gifts in this act of love, bread and juice, may they work within us, O Lord, to continue your work of salvation. This we humbly ask in the name of Christ. Amen.